You're listening to Criticaleye's Asia Leadership Podcast. Criticaleye is a global membership community with over 2 decades of experience supporting senior executives in their roles. We work with board-level executives, giving them opportunities to build their knowledge, skills, and access independent reference points outside of their immediate networks. Whether you're stepping up into a more senior role or aspiring to do so, looking to hone high-level stakeholder relationships, drive operational performance, build your own personal resilience as a leader, or have longer-term career goals such as moving into a plural career, Criticaleye's approach supports a range of leadership challenges and ambitions.
Hello and welcome to the Criticaleye Asia podcast, inspiring leaders to succeed. I'm Yu-Wen Hsiao, Marketing and Communications Manager at Criticaleye, and it's a great pleasure to be your host for today's episode. In today's episode, we're exploring topics that increasingly top of mind for executives across the region: how to lead successfully in Asia's complex and evolving landscape. So being a regional leader in Asia today means navigating rapid change, competitive priorities, and cultural diversity, while also staying grounded in the capabilities, values, and mindset needed to lead with clarity and purpose. So today we'll be discussing what it takes to lead at scales across diverse markets, how to build connected and resilient teams, and how leaders continue to grow and adapt in this fast-moving environment. So I'm really delighted to be joined by Lance Little, Head of Region of Roche Diagnostics Asia Pacific. Lance leads a team of over 6,000 employees across 16 locations and brings deep experience in developing leadership teams and shaping culture across diverse markets. So Lance, welcome. It's really great to have your insights as someone who's been leading across multiple markets in Asia for so many years. So before we dive into the discussion, could you please introduce yourself and maybe share a bit about your background and your leadership journey?
Thanks very much. Thanks, Coco. Thanks for the opportunity. Actually, really looking forward to this conversation. I think leadership in itself is a fascinating topic. I think leadership in very different cultural environments adds a whole other layer to the leadership journey. So looking forward to that. As far as my background and history goes, I've had, I'll say it quickly, 40 years in the healthcare industry, 30 years with Roche Diagnostics. And what I see as a huge privilege is I've been able to spend all of that time operating in the Asia Pacific environment. New Zealand is home for me, although I've lived the last 13 years here in Singapore. You know, it's been a phenomenal learning journey, sort of being able to challenge my traditional thinking or my singular New Zealand lens thinking as I've operated right across the entire Asia Pacific region. And for us, that means China, Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, up in the North Korea included, all of Southeast Asia, India, Pakistan, and Australia and New Zealand. So I've been fortunate to have been able to sort of interact with and learn and make all of the leadership mistakes you can make right across those organizations. And what I find is really interesting is so much of leadership comes down to the human dynamic, which in itself is a fascinating topic to explore.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lance, for your introduction. So given your experience across markets, so what do you think great leadership should be like?
I mean, it's a huge question, right? I think as leaders, we've got to consider where we came from. Right. So if we think many of us are in leadership positions and leadership roles because we're operationally good. So we might have done well in our career pathways, and that typically starts deeper in our organization or with our experience sets. And it's because, and we've done well and we've delivered well. So you get promoted and then all of a sudden you're in a leadership position. Well, I would challenge that a little bit. I would say, yes, you're in the chair or you're in the position, but are you a leader? And B, a very different question, a good leader. And the way I always look at this is go, what do I want in a leader? Because essentially there's always somebody further up the tree than us. And from a personal perspective, I sort of look at a couple of elements. I want to follow somebody. So by definition, if somebody is a leader, others are following. So as a follower, what do I look for in my leader? And I sort of break it down to a couple of things. I want somebody who is going in the right direction. So in other words, they know what they're doing. There's an expertise that they have within their role. Do they need to be the smartest person in the room? Not necessarily, but they need to have a depth of expertise in the environment they're working in. So are they going in the right direction, and does this sort of fit well with me? And then the second part of that I look for is this a person that I can follow? Right? Is this somebody that their value set resonates with me, for example? And I think most of us are very much the same. If we're genuinely interested in connecting with our leaders and having meaningful bonds where the leader can help the teams and create high-performing organizations, then I think it takes these sort of couple of elements. Is the leader going in the right direction? They know what they're doing, and can I connect with them? And I think this is an interesting dynamic in leadership, is around increasingly becoming comfortable and considering our people or our teams as complete human beings, both operationally technical and knowing how to motivate our people with the world that they're living in. Because I'm personally not a believer that we only bring half of ourselves to work. Especially in today's world, as leaders, we need to manage the fact that our teams are operating in a very unclear space where things going on outside of work will affect work performance, and vice versa. We take things home from work that affect our home life, perhaps. So for me, a great leader is somebody who can identify that, treat people as a complete human being, and then create the environment where our teams can excel. And I think a big part of leadership is architecting that environment, or getting the right ingredients, the recipe right of the team, such that people learn and grow from each other, and the collective is far bigger than the whole. So I guess sort of two elements in that I see at a very high level as what great leadership is.
Thank you, Lance. So in your view, is there any shifts or challenges you think many leaders still maybe a bit underestimate?
Well, again, I'd come back, and maybe I'm going to be a bit provocative here and say we find ourselves in leadership positions, but are we actually a leader, or am I still a manager, right? And they're two very different things. And I think a lot of the case, we've got managers, good managers, but we label them leaders. And perhaps, if we're in that situation, we think, great, I've made it. But I think one of the elements that come through around leadership is, I think you start a journey of leadership. Maybe not once you get to the so-called official position. Maybe you start that journey earlier. And we know there's leaders that display leadership behaviors right the way through our organizations. You don't have the title to actually be a leader. But I suspect we don't fully appreciate the leadership journey that is required. So, I think this is a big element of having a good look in the mirror. Okay, now I'm a leader now. Well, I need to keep growing. This is a dynamic and if you like, a skill set that I need to keep honing and working on. So what does that mean for me as a leader? Because the way I look at things, if leadership layers don't continue to grow and move up, their teams below them can never grow and move up either. So a conversation I have with a lot of my leadership teams around the countries, and we have in Roche Diagnostics, I've got 16 legal entities, 16 countries serving 22 markets in the diagnostic space. So I have 16 different leadership teams, and I'll often have a conversation with them, and I'll challenge them to say, are you learning as leaders? Because if you're not learning, there's no space below you for your teams to learn and grow. And I think this mindset of constantly evolving, or as we frame it within Asia Pacific, becoming a better version of ourselves, is something that I think leaders have really got to hone in on, and constantly be curious and understand that we're learning a new skill set. It may be different to the operational ones that have got us to here, but now we need to learn to become really, really good leaders. And I don't think people fully understand that. And that's a content learning and an internal learning, and that's often the harder one. They're the internal dynamics of going, how am I showing up, and getting feedback from other people and hearing from other people the honest truth that maybe, Lance, you're not showing up as well as you think you are. I learned a key lesson in some leadership training we did a number of years ago that's always stuck with me in my own personal journey. I played a lot of competitive sport in my younger years, and I'm naturally a competitive individual. Okay, great. I assumed that would be the same for everybody. So I would stand up at a town hall and go, oh, we had a great year, performance has been fantastic, you've all done a phenomenal job, imagine what we can do next year. That's just a natural narrative that plays well for somebody like me. What I did not appreciate or realize until I got the feedback was, for others that think the same way as me, great, they're all on board, landed beautifully. But half of the room doesn't think like that. And what they heard from me was, gee, no matter how well we do, this guy's never satisfied. That was what they received. So the big learning for me was, and that was, of course, never my intent. That was never, the message I wanted to send out to the organization. But that was what half the room received, because we all think differently. And that was a hard pill to swallow, because I had to realize that what I thought was a big strength of mine was only a strength half the time and was demotivating the other half of the time. So then you've got to look yourself honestly in the mirror and go, how am I going to evolve knowing what I now know? And I think this is something that leaders, I believe, don't do enough of. Great leaders, I believe, in my experience, and I've had some great leaders, are constantly learning and evolving, and they have a curiosity mindset. So if there was one thing I would say, that's probably number one. I guess the other element that I would sort of want to talk about is, how do we give people the opportunity to build trust? And I'll come back to what I touched on earlier on, where if we consider the complete human being, and my encouragement to all of my leaders is to sort of think about, instead of being a professional half and a personal half, and it's the professional half that shows up to the organization. I think in today's day and age, that's not enough. I genuinely don't believe that is going to get you there. And so the way I try and frame it for myself personally, and I think this helps some leaders, is to split the whole into three. And on the one side, we absolutely have the professional half. That's knowing what we're doing, being an expert in the role, knowing how to do the job, right? In other words, I know what direction to take. There's some knowledge and some skills there, and that constantly needs to be honed. On the other side of the whole, the opposite third, that's the private. That's the bit of me that you don't get. That's mine. The company doesn't get that. My teams don't get that. That's my private lens. Sitting between the two, in the middle, is what I would describe as personal. So that's the subset of private that I'm prepared to share. Now, why would I share that? Then becomes the question, because this gives people the opportunity to make a judgment on me as a leader. What's this guy's value set like? Is he doing things for the right reasons? What's his character? And I think this is a way of thinking about ourselves as leaders that perhaps might help people build deeper levels of trust, because we all know one of the core elements is to develop deep and appropriate levels of trust within an organization. And if you have that, then teams can really excel, and that's a foundation by which teams can really, really do well. And the leadership then grows and excels on top of that. But that can't be delivered without somebody being able to go, what's this guy like? What makes him tick? That's an element where I think leaders can maybe think a little differently about how they show up and how much of themselves they bring to the table. And we know, particularly in Asia, the Asia part of Asia Pacific, in my world, relationship is critical. So bringing yourself to the table in a way in which you're comfortable, I think, is a second element that I think leaders often miss. They stay in the operational piece.
So Lance, in such a complex and fast-changing environment, so how do you keep your leadership teams connecting and growing?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Connection, especially across Asia Pacific. I mean, it's a large geography with massively different cultures. Now, equally, there's very different cultures if you take an equivalent, say, across Europe or Latin America or something like that. The cultures are no doubt different, of course. Across Asia, though, I think the differences are quite severe by the time you sort of go top to bottom, if you like, and left to right. So understanding that, and this was something that we did, staying connected. In my leadership model, we have a few fundamental tools. Obviously, we're connecting on a regular cadence. These days, that's mostly remote, which is convenient but loses a human connection piece. And I think we always need to be aware of that. You have a different interaction with people when they're in the room versus when they're on a screen like this. So being aware of that is important. We also have a very large leadership team, which is a bit of an unusual experiment, if you like, that we've been running for the last 3 years, which is a fascinating experiment. But having a large leadership team also means that I can build different dynamics to keep people connected. For example, we have buddy groups and home groups within my leadership team, and they go beyond the meeting time. So buddy groups will connect. They'll have virtual drinks or virtual coffees or something like that. And teams can come together in smaller, more intimate groups, and they build relationships across those groups really, really nicely. So the connection piece is certainly a challenge, and it's certainly a challenge in today's world. But my encouragement here is don't default to digital interactions solely because that drives leadership teams and your leadership towards task, and it loses that human piece, as I like to describe it. So that's one dynamic. And I think the motivation then is, what are we here to do? All right. At a leadership level, it's more than just come to work. It's what do we really want to create? And I think creating a genuine discussion around what the team wants to achieve, whether there's a legacy involved in that. I think long-term thinking helps a lot here. I'll use that overused word, purpose, if you like. I'm cautious about using that word, but that's the sense. For us in healthcare, purpose is very strong, right? We run a good business, we save lives. Okay, so that's a wonderful place to be in, but not all companies have that. So I think finding a meaningful reason for showing up in the long term, medium to long term maybe, is a key element to keeping people motivated, because there's a load on leaders, right? There's a load on people in the organization. There's a huge load on leaders in today's business world. So those two elements, I think, meaningful ways of staying connected, but also being anchored to your vision or your purpose, and creating that vision and purpose not off a PowerPoint deck that's come from somewhere, but genuinely articulating what you as a leadership team want to create, what you want to leave behind, what's that legacy. And I think bringing a narrative together and genuinely living towards that helps keeping people motivated.
Yeah, so Lance, following what you just shared, I think feedback is also another key part of that. So how do you approach that to make sure it really drives growth and connection?
Yeah, feedback is an interesting one. And we've had a lot of conversations around feedback over the last year or so as we're constantly driving towards what we believe is a high-performing organization. And I mentioned earlier on, I'm a competitive individual. I played a lot of competitive sports. I had a conversation with myself, actually, around what's my relationship with feedback back then as an athlete and today. And it's a very interesting one. And I think very often, many of us, we'll receive feedback, but we don't really want it. Right? I'm going to have a feedback session with my boss. Okay. Right? It's a mindset that is somewhat defensive, right? But ironically, that in the athlete's world, you're hungry for feedback because you want to unpack weaknesses and you want to work on them. It's the same mechanism, and in my case, the same head, just in two different worlds. And so we talk a lot about the role of our leaders as being player coach. Okay. And what I mean by that is somebody who is playing the game, but they're also coaching or responsible for the team performance. And as a coach, you're going to have to deliver feedback, and you should be able to deliver that feedback. But one of the core elements that I take from the sport environment as a good coach understands what motivates their players, or in this case, our teams. So do I have an individual where that person responds to an arm around the shoulder, figuratively, an arm around the shoulder, right, and a bit of care, whereas the next person might respond to a boot in the pants, right, a much more harsher delivery of feedback. And so the coach or the leader in this case should really know their teams well, very well, and understand how feedback should be delivered and what is meaningful feedback for those individuals. So feedback is critical. I don't see how you can evolve. And we started this conversation by talking about growing and become better versions of ourselves, both as leaders and as teams. So I don't see how you can possibly evolve unless you're getting feedback from the system that you're operating in. And so I see feedback as fundamental, not optional, but feedback can be demotivating for some individuals. It can be motivating for others. And I think that the leader's role in delivering that feedback is knowing what's the best way to package that up for different individuals. And that's where the cultural dynamics across Asia become very, very critical. We've got some environments that if you're in it, they can be quite direct. I was general manager in Thailand for a period of time, and I was shocked. The smiling Thais who are always having a fantastic time, they're brutal in the office, in the meeting room. They're very direct. They can be extremely critical of each other. They can handle very direct and specific feedback. Whereas you might have other people coming from different cultural backgrounds that would be very demotivating if I delivered the feedback in that same way. So, feedback is the fuel that allows us to grow and develop, in my view, along with curiosity.
Because also Asia is quite diverse, right? So how do you work to build a common set of values that can actually unite your team and support your leadership approach?
This was an early question that I had a number of years ago in my head was, how do I create a red thread that we can draw through all of these different businesses and cultural dynamics that I'm responsible for in Asia Pacific? And how do I create an organization that is successful over decades and generations? So very much a long-term, mindset. What we did was we ended up coming together, and I didn't know how this was going to play out. I didn't have a preconceived idea. But we ended up asking the organization itself, describe the type of company you'd love to work for. And we sort of captured that. We overlaid that with my leadership team of the time, their value sets, and we came up with, I'm loath to call it a set of principles. It's called APAC Spirit, but it's more a reflection of something that unifies us as an Asia Pacific region, given all of the differences. And I think, and that became known as APAC Spirit. And these are very human principles. They're things like relationships built on trust and respect. They're things like be brave in conversation. A lot of it is human, not operational. And that's been actually in place coming up to 10 years now. So it didn't die on the vine. We moved it from a PowerPoint presentation into sort of the DNA of the organization. And people use this narrative that exists within this framework in describing their everyday, and they call each other out on it. Some of the elements that are there, they'll put it back on the day. They'll call me out on it, And so we created, as I say, this unifying piece of work that everybody can latch onto, whether you're in Japan with a very Japanese lens of the world, or whether you're a Kiwi from down in New Zealand with a very Kiwi lens on the world. These principles are very human, and they're at the right flight height. And I'll give you a great example of this. A lot of the time, organizations struggle in Asia to get open dialogue going. Right? Now, we landed on a flight height that said, be brave in conversation. I'm not going to tell you how to do it, because you should do it in your cultural context, whether that's in a Korean meeting room or a Japanese meeting room or a Filipino meeting room, whatever it is. Those contexts are different, but I do expect everybody to be brave and bring their ideas to the table. Now, in an Australian conversation, it might be, I'm just throwing my idea out there. My boss is sitting in the room, but I don't care. I'm throwing my idea out there. That's a very natural thing to do in that cultural environment. But that would be very inappropriate, and many organizations say in Japan. So I'm not saying everybody should speak in the meeting room, but what we're saying is I do expect people to be brave in conversation. So that flight height is a little bit higher to allow people to do things in the way they would like to do it. And in the Japanese context, it might be, I expect the individual to take the boss by the arm in the coffee break and say, I've got this idea, I want to bring it into the conversation, are you okay with that? And get it done. So I think that's one of the elements of how do you create that red thread across such diverse environments and different ways of thinking that exist across Asia Pacific, And a key to it is having the right flight height. If you're too prescriptive, it won't work in many of the diverse cultural contexts that we have across the region. But if it's too high, it won't mean anything either. So getting that flight height right is quite important.
So Lance, based on what you just shared, which leadership capabilities do you think are really critical at the moment in this region?
I think, generally speaking, I think genuine curiosity is something that I would fall back on. For me, as I say, I've operated in Asia Pacific for 30 years in the company, and I've been head of Asia Pacific for coming up 13. So I see it as a gift that I've been able to operate in these very different cultural environments. And I think one of the things that has allowed me to do that was I've been genuinely interested in how different parts of the world work. And I underline genuinely, right? You know, there's a fascination. I won't go into details, but when I was general manager in Thailand many years ago, it was my first role outside of, so I was very much Kiwi, New Zealander. First cultural shock was in living in Bangkok, and I'm running Thailand. Because the environment is based on Buddhist thinking, my commercial narrative that had worked for me for 17 years in New Zealand was 180 degrees wrong, right? But my narrative that I assumed would work everywhere could not be more wrong in the context of Buddhist Thailand. Now, that's not about understanding the product and its application in the healthcare system. That's understanding Buddhism. So I think this genuine curiosity is really, really important for leaders, particularly if you are working in a different cultural environment. So I'm not going to say Europeans working in Asia. It applies everywhere, actually. And I found along the way a very helpful anchoring, I would say, was when I read a book called The Geography of Thought. And it talks about the impact that Greek philosophy and logic has on the world and where it does not have an impact. And the Greeks essentially didn't come to Asia. So what I realize now is we're operating on a world, we're working in a world with, in my context, two operating systems. So I work for a Swiss company. I grew up in New Zealand. My operating system that is normal for me is one that is anchored in Greek philosophy and logic, as is corporate Roche in my case. However, that Greek logic is not the operating system that exists across Asia. So you might ask the question, well, what are the operating systems that work across Asia? In other words, what shapes the way people think in Asia? Now, if you look at it just very broadly, you've got Hinduism and Buddhism. Now, you could describe these things as religions or faiths or whatever you like. The point is they shape the way people think. Means that people, my team, think very differently to me. And I think as leaders or anybody working in a different environment, understanding that our people think differently to the way I might, and being aware of that is a big part to being effective as a leader in any environment that's not your own. In my case, being a leader across the Asia Pacific space where majority of my teams think very, very differently to the way I do. So I have to move and I have to be able to straddle these two operating systems or these two worlds as a leader. And I think you can't get there if you don't have that genuine curiosity. And I've seen leaders come in and they're on a 3-year path, putting a tick in the box of Asia Pacific. They're coming maybe from the western part of the organization. They come in, they're going to tell you how to do it for 3 years and they're bouncing out again. Those people generally don't do very well as leaders in Asia.
So Lance, explain what you just shared and also looking at your own leadership journey. So how have you continued to grow and adapt over time?
I would say that willingness to grow came later for me, actually. So I look back and I kind of made the same mistakes I just kind of described early on in our conversation, Coco. I was kind of that guy. I knew technically how to run a business. I knew the product. I knew how to shape a P&L, how to run the business. But I wasn't necessarily growing myself as a leader. So this has come later in my journey. And Actually, it was triggered by a period of time when I was being considered for a bigger role within the company. I remember having some good conversations and got some great advice from the likes of Charlie Wagstaff, for example, at Criticaleye. And I did not get that next role up. And I was in a moment where I go, well, do I take what I know how to do and do it with somebody else? Or do I evolve my own leadership and take my organization to another level? And I chose the latter. And that meant that I was going to have to change. I was going to have to lead differently. And again, through some external input, another extremely valuable person, Paul Byrne from Leadership Circle Group, has been a good mentor to me along the way. And, he challenged me to, go from Lance the Fixer to Lance the Shaper. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means instead of being the battlefield general, in Paul's words, instead of being the battlefield general, which I was very good at being, I had to move to become the diplomat that avoids the war in the first place. And that was a big shift in thinking for me. So that then started the leadership journey, in my case, somewhat later in my leadership pathway, if you like. And so I'm very curious to learn from others, to see what success looks like, actual success. I'm not a big theorist, so I like to learn from people who have actually walked the walk and made the mistakes and take their real life learnings. That's a key element that drives me. In all areas, I look at businesses and sports teams in the same way. They're a group of individuals working towards a singular goal that have to work together. So I take a lot of sporting examples as well and models that work very, very well there. The other thing that I've learned to do, and I do it very regularly, is look in the mirror, as I say, have that honest look in the mirror. Now, I talked about APAC Spirit earlier on as this sort of unifying framework of some core elements that is a reflection of what we value in Asia Pacific and also what we aspire to be. So I have a habit of just at the end of each week, I try and find some time. Sometimes that's sitting on a plane. Sometimes that's when I get home. And I just pull out APAC Spirit, and it's a one-pager. And I rate myself against some of those core elements. How did I do this week with respect to building relationships built on trust and respect is one of our key elements. So I then think back at my week, and I have my calendar in front of me, and I go, how did I do there? Did I actually build trust amongst that team in that conversation? Or did I get very reactive and lose my cool a bit? And I do that on a weekly basis. That's somewhat retrospective. The other thing that I do is I try and get ahead of it. Each morning when I have a coffee, I look at my day and I go, how do I, as a leader, how do I need to show up, still being authentic, in that hour or that 45-minute meeting? So I try and be deliberate at what I bring to the table. Is it a team that's doing really, really well and they just need some encouragement and some support and know that I've got their back and they're doing well? Or is it a team that's really, really struggling and I need to step in on the front foot and go, righto, guys, here's what we're doing, and take the lead? So again, this is I think a lot about the dynamic nature of being a leader. You're still getting Lance, but I may bring different tools out of the toolbox depending on what's needed during the course of the day. So don't always get that right either, but that's how I try and be deliberate about, growing as a leader, and adding value. I think I'm constantly asking, am I adding value to the system and the organization and to the people within it?
Let's really appreciate the insight and the experience you just shared. So to wrap up our conversations, what final piece of advice would you like to share with leaders to strive and be successful in Asia?
To be successful in Asia, I think it's all of the things that all leadership conversations have in them. I think, and if I was to maybe pull out three elements, I would think about it is stay grounded on the purpose, right? I don't know. It depends on how far ahead you think as an industry. Healthcare is a long-term game, so we think long-term. And so, staying grounded to that purpose, being consistent in that, because when times get tough, people kind of get buried in the day-to-day. As a leader, you need to keep them focused on that end goal, that end game. So that's a critical element. as I touched on earlier on, and I think this applies to anybody leading in an environment that's not their own, is be humble and curious. So be humble enough to say, in my case, I know how to do diagnostics, but I don't know the rules of the game in your world. Let me understand that. So it's been humble enough to say, I'll understand the rules first, and then I'll bring my skills to the table. And constantly being curious about understanding the environments that we're living in and why they may show up differently to what I might think they should based on where I come from or my own experience set. And I think finally, it's what we were talking about a second ago. It's a commitment to being on that constant journey of self-improvement. I want to be a better leader tomorrow than I was yesterday. Why should leadership be any different to any other role within an organization? I want to be a better finance manager. I want to be a better engineer. I want to be a better supply chain lead, whatever it is. I think importantly, having this mindset of continuous improvement. I'm a big believer in the 1%. Don't worry about trying to do moonshots, right? You don't want to change that overnight. But 1% incremental gains really adds up over time. And I think from a leadership journey, that'd be a big one for me as sort of a third element. So stay grounded to your purpose, be curious and humble, and commit to a leadership journey that involves evolution and growth.
Thank you so much, Lance, for sharing your valuable insights and experience with us today. I think it's really truly inspiring to hear how thoughtful leadership and adaptability and the strong focus on culture can drive success in such a dynamic region. So really, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Coco. I hope there's something useful in there for somebody. I'm not sure, but really appreciate the opportunity to chat. Thank you.